Okay, so for payroll, we're going to start learning about gross earnings, wages, and salaries. We're going to talk about piecework and commissions, Social Security and Medicare and other taxes, and income tax withholding. Simply said, the payroll systems, the payroll process is really not that complicated of a deal. It's just a lot of steps you have to go through in order to make it happen. So sometimes it gets confusing, but the good news is it's repetitive in nature, so once you get it down, you got it pretty well. So I'm going to go ahead and blow this up a little bit so that it makes it a little bit easier for us to see. Well, I can only do it so much, so. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about is gross earnings, wages, and salaries. In essence, to compute your wages, well, first of all, we're going to talk about the overall computations. We're going to take gross earnings and we're going to subtract any deductions from that. The gross earnings minus deductions, and that's going to give us the net pay. Now, in doing so, in order for us to come up with gross earnings first, let's take one step at a time. The net pay is ultimately what we want to get to. But first we have to talk about gross earnings. And so gross earnings are really computed by taking the number of hours worked times the rate per hour. So most of you are familiar with turning in timesheets and knowing what they're about. So here's an example of a timesheet. And you're going to be submitting to your payroll department all the hours that you've worked. And so the hours are going to be added up in total. And then from there, they're going to take the number of hours that you've worked and they're going to multiply it by the rate that's appropriate. And so it really just kind of depends on the circumstance or situation as to how that really works. So in essence, the way this shows is that the way this is going to work is that, as an example here, Sarah Brinsky is doing payroll for 2 employees at her Starbucks store. She must first complete a payroll, and so they're going to turn in a timesheet just like it is. So L. Nelson worked for 2, 4, 8, 6, and 3 hours during the week. So obviously Nelson is a part-time person. Or worked as well, they work part-time. So 3.5 one day, 3 Tuesday, 7 Wednesday, 6.75 Thursday, and Friday 7 hours. So in essence, this timesheet is essentially given, and this is the information that's provided for you. You're going to have to compute the total hours, and then the rate of pay is going to be provided as well. So in this case, it's total hours we're going to have to compute. We have the rate, and then we're going to take the total hours and we're going to multiply it by the 10.75. So as an example in this case here, we're just simply going to take 2, 4, 8, 6, 3. We're going to add those across the board. That turns out to be 23 hours. And then for 3.53, 7, and 6.75, and 7, we're going to add those across the board, and we're going to come up with 27.25 hours. Now, what you need to round it to the nearest will be pretty clear on your instructions on your assignment, so let's not worry too much. Right now they're giving us to the nearest hundred, so we'll go with that. We'll then multiply the number of hours by the rate per hour, so in this case it's 23 hours, and the 23 hours was for Nelson, and then we're going to look at Nelson's rate. It's 10.75, so we take the 23 times 10.75, we're going to come up to 247.25. Or worked for 27.25 hours, we're going to take that, multiply it by $9.80, and that gives us the total for OR. So now we can fill in the blanks that we're missing here. The blanks we're missing here, but now we can fill them in with the hours that we've computed. So in this case, it's going to be 23 hours for Nelson, 27.25 hours for OR, and run the gross earnings or the gross amounts by just simply taking the amounts we've computed here and down to here. Okay, 247.25, 267.05. So now we have the gross earnings for each individual. Before we go too much further, that's just the gross. We're going to have to turn on and find some deductions for it. But for now, at least we have a good feel for how the gross earnings. Now, one of the things that you might be familiar with already is that in the state of California and in most states, or actually across the United States, there is a rule that requires employers to pay overtime for anyone who works more than 40 hours. So overtime means that if you work in any week, if you work more than 40 hours, then that which is above the 40 hours is going to be subject to overtime rates. Now, overtime rates vary. Well, they don't really vary. It's in essence the overtime rate is going to be time and a half, whatever your hourly rate is. Okay. So in essence, the objective is to make sure that employees are treated fairly. If you're asking them to work more than 40 hours, you'll get time and a half within a week. So 40 hours, and that's the weekly overtime rate. Now, just so that you know, California has a little bit more stringent rule than that, but let's let's start with that. So for every 40 hours in a week, you're going to have to turn around and get paid some overtime. That's a United States rule. That's a nationwide rule. California has a little bit more stringent rule. We'll talk about that when we get there. So if we go back again and look at the ledger that was completed for the payroll ledger for overtime, you'll see that now we have Lanier and Morse that we're going to be computing for. And if you add up the total hours here, we have Lanier has 6, 9, 8.25, 8, 9, and 4.25. If we add those across the board, we're going to end up with 44.75. So now we know we're in trouble. Well, not trouble. Now we know that we got to take care of 44.75. We've got some overtime we're going to have to compute. In addition to that, Morse worked total. We're going to add this across just like we learned to do before. The difference is now we're looking at 46.25 hours. So that also crossed over the 40 hours per week. So what do we have to do? Well, we know that the 44.75 hours, we know that the 40 hours are going to be okay, so we're going to subtract that from the total and we're going to get 4.75 hours. In this case, Lanier has worked 4.75 hours overtime, while Morse, 46.25 hours minus the 40, Morse has worked 6.25. So you're just going to take the total hours and subtract the 40 hours, and you know whatever's remaining is the overtime hours. Now we're going to do two computations. One, we're going to take the 40 hours, the basic rate. That's going to be based upon the basic rate. In this case, it's $10.30. Lanier's at $10.30. So we're going to take Lanier's 40 hours multiplied by 10.3, and we're going to get 412. Morse, on the other hand, has a regular rate of 9.48. So the 9.48 multiplied by the 40 hours is going to give us a gross amount of 379. Now we've only accounted for the 40 hours so far. So now we've got to take into consideration the overtime, and we're going to look at the overtime that we computed. So we have the overtime here, the 4.75 hours overtime. So for Lanier, we're going to take the 4.75 hours and we're going to multiply by the overtime rate. Now the overtime rate is simply going to take the hourly rate and multiply it by 1.5. So really we're going to extend this out just by taking 4.75, that's the number of overtime hours, multiplied by the rate. The regular rate is $10.30, and then times that by 1.5. Your extension is going to be $73.39. Okay? Morse, on the other hand, works 6.25 hours. 6.25 hours times, oh, that's overtime hours, by the way. We're going to take the 6.25 overtime hours, multiply that by $9.48. That's the regular rate, but then we're going to take that result and multiply it by 1.5. So now that represents the time and a half, right? And so in this case, we're going to get $88.88. So it doesn't apply to all the 40 hours, just the amount of time that was overtime is you're paid at a higher rate. That's the time and a half. And I guess the logic is that, well, if you're going to ask employees to work over 40 hours, then they should be compensated appropriately, especially if it's all done in one time, or at least in 1 week. Anytime that you work in a week over 40 hours, then that's when it's going to be subject to overtime. All right? So now we're going to take Lanier and Morse. We computed both their regular rates and their overtime rates. For Lanier, we computed 412 for regular. There's the 412. We then took Lanier's overtime of 73.39, and we're going to add those two together. And those two are really going to compute how much Lanier is going to get as far as gross wages are concerned. So that plus that, 412 plus 73.39, is going to equal $45.39. Morse, on the other hand, regular time rates were, or total amount earned from regular is $379.20. We're going to then add to that $88.88, and then from there we're going to add those two together, and we're going to end up with $468.08. Okay, so $379.20 plus $88.88 equals $468.08. Now we can then finish off the timesheet and actually run it across the board. And if you were to figure it out on like a timesheet or some ledger that you're going to be using to compute this all, that's kind of like it would work. You'd have your regular hours, you'd come up with your total regular hours, total overtime hours, and then run the rates accordingly. Okay? Now, that's one way of computing the overtime. There's another way, which is quite interesting, that we're actually exposed to this. I don't know of anybody that actually does this, but what you could do is you could take, essentially, take the straight time earnings, which is the total hours worked times the regular rate. So take all of the hours worked, all of it, whatever the number of hours for the whole week, do that. Then figure out, well, what's that at times the regular rate, and then add to that what they call an overtime premium, which is the half. See that the half amount, but the extra half per hour is only going to be applied to that which is overtime Okay, so we take the overtime hours, we're going to multiply it by half regular rate. And we'll take the straight time earnings plus the overtime premium, and we'll come up with gross earnings. Okay? So an example of this would be on the next page. We're on 207 now. We started off on 207. We're on 208 now, I'm sorry. So now we're looking at this week, Holly Kelly worked 40 regular hours and 12 overtime hours. Her regular rate of pay is $17.40 per hour. Find her total gross pay using the overtime premium method. So we're going to take Kelly's total hours of 40 plus the 12 hours of, which gives you a grand total of 52. And her overtime premium, 0.5, is going to be $17.40 times the 0.5, which is $8.07. So just remember, the $8.70 is the premium. That's what we're going to add to the total amount that's going to be paid. So then we're going to take the total 52 hours and we're going to multiply it by the straight rate of $17.40. So none of this is at regular rate, so there's not going to be any premium here. But then we're going to say, okay, those overtime, we're going to give you another half hour, or that's the half of the regular rate. We're going to add that, so we're getting the time and a half, but we're getting to it a different way. We'll take the 12 hours, overtime hours, multiplied by 870. 870 represents the half. What's that? We got that $17.40. Multiplied by 0.5 gives you the 870. So this is the, they say time and a half. Well, the time is already built into this 52 hours. Now we're going to give them the extra half. That's only 870, but that's what they call the overtime premium. So 870 times the number of overtime hours, which in this case is 12 hours. 12 times 870 gives us 104.40. So we're going to add this up. We end up with $1,009.20. Just so that we're clear, there's two ways to come up with the same answer. I mean, there's really no difference in the results. You're still going to have that same result. Okay. So let's take a look at the next example. Find overtime earnings for 8 hours of work per day. Now, that's what we call daily overtime. In the state of California, there's a little bit more stringent rule where essentially people have to be paid overtime for any hours worked over 8 in one day. So even if you're part-time and you only work like 20 hours in a week, if you work in any one of those days more than 8 hours consecutively, then you're going to have to get paid what's called overtime. So in that case, then we've got to track in a little bit different way. We've got to be in more detail. We've got to track how much overtime one is actually earned by day. Okay. So in this case, we have regular listed. We have looks like it's Jason Polanski, and Jason is given $10.10 per hour, and we're going to find the gross earnings. But now in this case, the total amount of hours, it looks like 28 hours of regular and 6. Well, really, if you think about it, if you're just following the strict federal rule, then there's really no overtime because it didn't go over 40 hours. But in California, that's not the case. Anytime you work any more than 8 hours in one day, you're going to get paid overtime. So there's going to be 2 hours on Monday. Apparently you worked 10 hours on Monday, so 8 of it was regular and 2 is going to be overtime. And then on Thursday, another 12 hours. Wow, that's a long time. So they worked 12 hours, 8 hours of regular and 4 hours of overtime. So even though they didn't cross over the 40-hour rule per week, they still are going to be subject to overtime for the 6 hours that they worked, which really is the total hours that were worked over 8 hours in any one day. So, then we know how to do this computation. It's the same as before. We're going to take the $10.10 before we do anything and multiply it by 1.5 so that we know what our overtime rate is. And that turns out to be $15.50 per hour. We're good there. We have to 15. But now we have to remember, okay, how much of it was regular? Well, we look across here, it's 28 hours of regular. How much of it is overtime? 6 hours are overtime. So then we're going to take the 28 hours multiplied by 1010, that's regular, 2280, and then 6 hours times 15, this is the overtime rate, and we'll get a total of 990. So then we add these all together and we get 370. Okay? Okay, so we're going to continue on looking at the next example here. We just finished up with Polanski. Now we're going to go on and look at understanding the way double time shift differentials and split shift premiums actually work. So in essence, since the rule in California is that anytime you work more than 8 hours in a day, you're going to be subject to overtime. There is also in California the requirement that if you work any more than 12 hours, you're actually going to get paid double time. Instead of time and a half now, it becomes double time. Anyway, so let's move on to finding equivalent earnings for different pay periods. Now, many of us are actually paid in different types of pay periods. There's monthly, that means you get one paycheck per month. There's semi-monthly, meaning you get paid twice a month. Bi-weekly would mean that every 2 weeks you get a paycheck, and then a weekly would be a check every week. Every person seems to prefer different methods. Any method that you end up using would be okay. It's just a matter of getting used to that and that process. So monthly, 12 months, 12 times out of the year. Semi-monthly, you're going to be twice each month. That means twice a month, and there's 12 months in a year. That's 24 times in a year. Bi-weekly, you'll get paid every 2 weeks. Every 2 weeks means there's going to be 52 weeks in a year, but you're only going to pay every 2, so you're going to divide by 2. That's 52. That means it's 26 paychecks you're going to get. And then in a year, 26 paychecks you'll get in a year. And then in the 50, if you're getting paid every week, then it's 52 weeks, or 52 checks in a year. Now, in many cases, people want to take, for example, you get offers at several different areas for different jobs, and they're getting paid differently. And so you want to figure out, well, which one's the better way? Which is the better option? So in this case, we're going to look at Scott Perrine has a weekly salary of $546. Julie Circle has a semi-monthly salary of $1850. Tanya McCarley has bi-weekly salary of $1686. And Bill Leonard gets paid a monthly salary of $2890. Now the question really is well, which one's the better, which one's the higher one? And so we're going to have to really find a common ground here. And in essence, we can really convert these to all the common grounds. We just have to convert each one of them to all the different elements or a different way of looking at it. You can look at it per year, per month, or per week. So in this case, we're going to look at each individual. First of all, we'll take it Scott Perrine, and we'll probably just cover 2 of these, and then I'm sure you can take it from there. But let's look at Scott Perrine. He's got a weekly salary of $546. Well, if we're essentially looking at the per year, per month, and per week, well, we can fill that in right now. $546 per week, we're done. We only have to figure out the other 2. Well, the question is what's Scott's annual salary? Well, if we take the $546 per week and we multiply it by 52, we're going to get $28,392. Now, if your comparison person that you're going to be looking at is per year, then now you have something you compare to. It's difficult to compare per week to per year, but now that we've converted this to per year, now we can compare it to any of the others if they're per year. And then we're also going to go ahead and do it per month. So we'll take this $28,392 per year and just divide that by 12, and that's going to give us $23,66 per month. So we're good to go. Now we know exactly per year, per month, per week. We'll do Tanya. We'll just take a look at Tanya. Tanya's was at $1686 bi-weekly salary, so we'll focus in on her. $1686 bi-weekly, so we're going to say, well, how does that convert to per year? Well, there's 26 pay periods in a bi-weekly. Since you're getting paid twice or once every 2 weeks, there's 26 pay periods. So we're going to take that 1686 multiplied by 26, and that's going to give us the annual amount that Tanya's going to be earning. Now that we have the annual amount, we can divide that by 12 to come out with the per month. And then now that we have the per month, well, actually we'll take the per year and we're going to divide that by, we're going to take the per year, we could divide that by 52. Or we could start with this, well, this was supposed to be every 2 weeks, so let's just take that and divide it by 2. And that's going to give us what you want per week, okay? So different ways you can get to the same number, but you can see the objective here is to find a way to compare Scott Perrine to Tom. So now we can see that it might have been difficult to see what Scott was making compared to Tanya, but now that we have converted it to comparable numbers, now we can see that if we just focus on per year, Scott's making $28,392, while Tanya's really making quite a bit more. She's making $43,836. So you can see Tanya's making quite a bit more money than Scott. All right. Let's move on. Now, contrary to what people believe, it's often people say, well, if you're salary, you don't get any overtime. And that's not necessarily the case. The state of California doesn't really distinguish what they call salary. In fact, they don't even have that in, I don't believe they have that in the law of employment law, the laws of employment, okay? What they do use is what's called exempt versus non-exempt. And essentially every employee, it's determined based upon the nature of the work and what they do. The state of California has determined that you're either an exempt or non-exempt. And when we say exempt, that means you're exempt from overtime requirements. So if you're a salaried individual, by the state of California, you're considered to be exempt, so you don't have to get overtime. But there are certain types of positions where employers may want to give what is considered to be a minimum amount per week or per month. And that minimum amount is really treated as a salary. However, if they work any more than 40 hours in a week, or if they work more than 8 hours in a day, then by law, unless that position is considered to be an exempt position, then by law the employer is still required to pay overtime. So in other words, you would have a salary employee that essentially has a minimum amount, but not a maximum amount, depending on the position. So if you work in a position, let's say for example, as an executive secretary who is essentially by nature of his or her work isn't really very administrative, or that they don't make very high level decisions, that position may be considered to be a salary because you want to offer the minimum amount they would make, but still if they work over 40 hours, then you have to get some overtime. All right, so the example here, we're going to look at Monica Gonzalez, earns $936 a week as an assistant to the vice president of a community bank. A normal work week for her is 40 hours. Find her gross earnings if she works 45 hours 1 week and is paid time and a half for everything over 40 hours. So that's an example of her being on salary, but yet in her case, her position does not allow her to be exempt, so she's got to be paid overtime. And so as a result, then she's going to get paid for the 5 hours. But that gets a little bit tricky because she has a weekly salary of $936. So what you have to do is then take that $936 and you're going to divide that by 40 hours in a week. So you're going to come up with an hourly rate. In this case, it's $23.40. So even though she's going to get paid a minimum no matter what hours she works, so $936, if she goes over the overtime hours, which is 40, then she would be eligible for overtime. So we take the $23.40 rate, and that multiplied by time and a half is going to give us the overtime rate. Okay, so regular rate times time and a half will give us the overtime rate. So she gets her regular wages, her base wage of $936, that's the salary, and then we're going to multiply that. Then the 5 hours that she worked overtime. The 5 hours that she worked overtime, right? Because it says that she worked 45 hours. So 5 hours times $35.10, that's the overtime rate, and she's getting $175. So her gross earnings is not going to be just the $936, it's going to be $1,111.50. That's her gross earnings, all right? Now, whether or not an employee is exempt or non-exempt, that's employment law, and if we would have class, we could talk a little bit more about it. But for the most part, if you're a highly administrative type position, if you're like a VP or upper management, then you're going to be considered an exempt individual. If you're a supervisor running a department, it just kind of depends on what your normal responsibilities are. But in many cases, you may want to offer a supervisor a salaried rate so that you know they'll get a minimum amount, but they're not going to be considered exempt, so therefore they're non-exempt employees that are salaried, and that means you will have to pay them some overtime. Just like what we figured out for Monica Gonzalez. Okay.